just to start, I'd like to talk about some of the high-yield topics that you definitely want to know before heading into the MCAT. So the Chemical and Physical Foundations of Biological Systems section of the MCAT covers organic chemistry, general chemistry, physics, and biochemistry. So there are a lot of different things they could test you, but some of the highest yield things that I really emphasize to students that they should learn are thermodynamics, especially with regards to biological systems, acid-base equilibria, stoichiometry, as well as some Newtonian physics and work. And those are just some of the highest yield topics, but really the MCAT can cover a very broad range of topics. But knowing those can ensure that you'll do well on a fair number of questions. Some of the strategies that I recommend to students are, first, the Socratic method. Perhaps you've heard of this before, but the Socratic method is all about asking yourself questions to help yourself get to the right answer. And it sounds a little counterintuitive to think, well, by asking myself more questions, how do I get the answer to the question? But really, it's a way of guiding your thought process to get to the right place. And we'll go through that today and actually do a practice question right after this. Next, for calculation-based questions, which are pretty common on the CP section, I recommend that people solve symbolically first, that they use scientific notation and know their exponent rules really well, and then also round numbers that are hard to work with. The MCAT is designed to allow you to do every question in under a minute. So if you round your answers judiciously, you should be able to get every question right if you use the right arithmetic. And then lastly, I really encourage students to not be afraid to draw stuff out, especially with physics, free body diagrams. By drawing stuff out, you can really simplify what could seem to be a very complicated question down to something much more manageable. So here's a question. I'll read through it and try to familiarize yourself with it. It reads, the radius of the aorta is about 1 centimeter, and blood passes through it at a velocity of 30 centimeters per second. A typical capillary has a radius of about 4 times 10 to the negative 4 centimeters, with blood passing through it at a velocity of 5 times 10 to the negative 2 centimeters per second. Using these data, what is the approximate number of capillaries in a human body? And you're probably like me. The first time I read this, it was like, whoa, that was a lot of information. Where do I even start? And so let's just start asking ourselves some questions and seeing if we can get ourselves to the right answer. Trying to guide our thought process. And I'll ask a series of questions. I'll answer them, but I also want each of you to try to think about it in your heads, just to help you follow along the logical process we're going through. So the first question I would ask would be, and what is the question really asking? And so I would focus on this last clause, or this last sentence. What is the approximate number of capillaries in a human body? And so I'd ask myself, okay, is this a number I should know? Or is this something that I have something I could use in the question stem to answer it with? And I would think, most likely, I do not have to know the number of capillaries in the human body. That's a pretty random question. So I would assume that everything I need is up here in the question stem. And so the next question I would ask is, well, what information do they provide me with? Well, first, they tell me the radius of the aorta. They tell me the velocity that the blood goes through the aorta. They also tell me the radius of the capillaries and how blood passes through at a certain velocity through the capillaries. And so I know the velocities, and I also know the radii. And so with that information, I'm just going to ask myself, well, how can I use the velocity of blood and the areas or the dimensions of those capillaries in aorta to really figure out how blood passes through, or how many capillaries there are in the human body? And I would say, well, I know an equation that I could apply here. I know an equation for a volumetric flow rate, because I know that in the human body, blood is going to pass through the aorta at the same volumetric flow rate as it will pass through the capillaries. And that equation that I know that explains that is Q equals AV. And the volumetric flow rate for the aorta will be the same as the volumetric flow rate for the capillaries. So I can set AV equal to one another. So A1 V1 equals A2 V2. But what I know is that there are a lot more capillaries than aorta. Then we only have one aorta in our body, but we have numerous capillaries. And this A represents the cross-sectional area at a given point. So for the capillaries, I would need to multiply it by N, where NA2 represents the total cross-sectional area of all the capillaries, where A2 is just the cross-sectional area of one. So now that I have this equation set up, I'm just going to solve for N. So N equals A1 V1 over A2 V2. And as I mentioned earlier, I really recommend solving symbolically first. And so I'm just going to write out this symbolically. So N equals the cross-sectional area of the aorta, which is pi R1 squared times V1 over the cross-sectional area of a capillary, which is pi times R2 squared over V2. So right off the bat, I realize that the pi's are going to cancel out, and I'm left with R1 squared times V1 over R2 squared times V2. Sorry if that's a little hard to read. And then I'm just going to plug in numbers and solve it and see if I got the right answer. So N equals 1 centimeter squared times 30 centimeters squared, or 30 centimeters per second over 4 e to the negative 4. We're using scientific notation. Squared times 5 times e to the negative 2 centimeters per second. And then I'll just do some math, and I should get my answer. So on the top, I'll just have 30 centimeters per second cubed, making sure my units are right. And the bottom, 4 squared times 5, that's just 16 times 5. So that's going to be 80. And then I'm just going to do my exponent rules. E to the negative 4 to the second is going to be e to the negative 8. And then I'm going to add that to e to the negative 2. So it's going to be e to the negative 2 down here. And as you recall earlier, I also mentioned rounding. So 3/8 to me is about 0.375. It's also close to 4. So I'm just going to do 0.4. And then my exponent, I miswrote that, is going to be e to the 10. Because when it goes to the top, to the numerator, it's going to be positive. So this is my answer, and I'm going to compare it to these answer choices. And what I see quickly is that this is the exact same as C. And that's just an example of how I'd go about a CP question using calculations and the Socratic method.
Thank you, Lyndon. Next up, we have our CARS section, which stands for critical analysis and reasoning skills. For that, we have Claire. She's one of our resident CARS experts. She's a specialist in the one source cold call method to improve student active speed and retention. She is currently gearing up to start medical school at Vanderbilt.
Everyone, thanks us all for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the critical analysis and reasoning skills, commonly known as the CARS section. And this seems to be the section that students either love or hate. So some of the common passage topics are the humanities and social sciences. So philosophy, the arts, history, political science, literature, etc. Some of the strategies and test taking tips I would teach if we were a tutor here. The first one and the most important one is to practice active reading skills. So a lot of times students are worried about time in this section, and they will try to get to the end of a passage as soon as possible. And by the time they get to the end, they can't really say what they just read or the main idea or really anything about the passage. So one of the main things we try to develop is active reading skills so that you can build your comprehension, and then the speed will kind of follow. And the next one is to refer back to the passage often. CARS is different from other sections in that almost everything you need to answer the questions can be found in the passage, aside from a little bit of vocabulary here and there. So not relying solely on your memory of the passage, particularly when you come across a question that refers to a specific paragraph or has a quote in it, it's always important to go back and find that exact paragraph or quote in the passage. The next one is to understand your own timing. The CARS section is only 53 questions, so it seems like a little less than the other ones, but this still is typically the most time-sensitive section for test takers just because of the intense reading that's required. So knowing your own timing and sort of how long you're going to take per passage can help you budget and know when you need to flag a question, move on, just to make it through all the passages in time. And the last one is to keep an eye out for important words. A lot of times in the question stem, the AMC will use words like not or most challenging to the author's point of view. So that's an important thing to keep an eye out for. And additionally, in the answer choices, words like all, every, always, never, things like that really extreme language can be a clue that an answer choice is either right or wrong, since even if it's a little bit wrong, it's wrong. So that sort of extreme language can be something to keep an eye out for. So moving into a practice question, and don't worry about reading any of this or all of this. We're going to kind of go through it. And if this was an actual car section, you would have already read the whole passage, but that's not really conducive to the Zoom meeting. So we're just going to kind of go through this question together. So which of the following scenarios would most challenge the limited version of the strong adversity hypothesis that Haidt endorses? So kind of like Landon, the first thing I'm going to do is ask myself, what is this question really asking me to do? And the first thing it's asking us to do is to understand what the limited version of the strong adversity hypothesis is. And then the second thing it's asking us to do is to find an answer choice that challenges that idea. So the first thing I'm going to do is look for those words in quotes in the passage itself. And luckily I've pulled out the paragraph for us that has those quotes. So the first thing I see is adversity hypothesis right away. And that tells us that the adversity hypothesis is that suffering builds character. So that's kind of the thing we're keeping in mind as our adversity hypothesis, is that adversity builds character idea. So the next thing I'm looking for is the limited version of the strong adversity hypothesis. So as I keep going through the paragraph, I see the weak version first. Don't want that, which is adversity can lead to growth. But if we keep going, we find the limited version of the strong view, just as the question asks. And that is that adversity must cause growth. And it must cause growth under these circumstances that he goes on to explain. So the three circumstances that are explained are that for it to require growth, it must happen during young adulthood, to the right people, so those with the right social and psychological resources, and to the right degree, so not too severe to cause PTSD. So with that in mind, I can go back to the question. I've sort of answered that first part of the question, which is what is the limited version of the strong adversity hypothesis? And that is adversity must cause growth under these three circumstances. So if I were to think to myself, what's something that would challenge this adversity hypothesis, that would be a circumstance in which all of these three different things, the young adulthood, social and psychological resources, and the severity, those were all present and it didn't lead to growth. So that would be something that would challenge this view. So looking at the answer choices, the first one is an old woman with a strong lifelong marriage experiences significant adversity when she loses her husband, but fails to grow as a result. So right away, that's an old woman and significant adversity. So that already violates two of the claims in this limited version. So that's not really a viable answer choice because it doesn't follow his hypothesis, so it can't really challenge his hypothesis. The next one is a middle-aged man who lives alone and is traumatized by even the slightest inconvenience. Similarly, that one was adversity that didn't lead to growth. And additionally, it was a middle-aged man, so he didn't fall into that young adulthood category and had a history of depression, so not the right social and psychological resources. And then looking at C and D, we have a young woman for both of them, or a young man and a young woman, so a young adult for both of them. So that looks good. The first one has close family connections, undergoes relatively minor suffering when losing his beloved cat, but is debilitated for life. So that one looks like a good option to me because it fits the three categories. It's a young man, he has the right social and psychological resources with the close family connections, and it's relatively minor suffering. However, it did not cause growth for him. So I'm going to tentatively choose that as my right answer, but still read the fourth option just in case it looks better to me for any reason. So a young woman with healthy coping skills, those two sound good, loses her entire family in a tragic accident and develops post-traumatic stress disorder. So we can see that that one is in violation of the hypothesis or doesn't follow the hypothesis because of that PTSD aspect. So that's kind of the logic that you would use in filling out or answering a CARS question. It would be a little bit easier if you had already read the passage, but that's kind of how you need to figure out what the AAMC is asking and use the passage information to help you answer those questions.
Thank you, Claire. Up next, we have our biochem, and that is going to be presented by Landon again.
Hello again. So the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems part of the test is a lot like the CP, or the chemical and physical science section of the test. And I really approach them very, very similarly. The only difference is that the B&B section covers a lot more on amino acids, protein structures, enzymes, and it is usually has a lot more questions about research techniques and just analyzing graphs, although those certainly show up in the CP section as well to a large extent. But like I mentioned, amino acids, it's imperative that you know all the amino acids, you memorize all their R groups or the parts that make them different, that you also know special facts about them. For example, cysteine will form disulfide bridges, or which amino acids can be phosphorylated, which ones are acidic, basic, polar, non-polar. So just really knowing those like the back of your hand, that's going to be your best friend and get you the most points. And then how those amino acids play into protein structure. How do they fold? Do they fold inwards or outwards, depending on if they're polar or non-polar? They contribute to different protein structures. And then lastly, enzymes, knowing line mover Burke plots, Michaelis-Menten, the different types of inhibition. Those three topics are going to come up on every single test. Even though there are a variety of other topics that will individually show up, those are the ones that will show up every single time. And some of the strategies I recommend for students to know are first to rephrase the question stem. So once you read the question, sometimes it's an entire paragraph like we saw last time in CP, but we need to narrow it. We need to boil it down to a single phrase that we can really answer. Second, I recommend that the student read each answer before eliminating anything. And this is a lot like Claire did. She picked an answer tentatively, but she kept on reading all of them. And that'll keep you from accidentally picking an answer that maybe has a small flaw in it that you won't see in the initial read through. And third, I recommend that students use the Socratic method, just like they do in the CP section. It's very, very helpful, especially when there are graphs and you have to try and analyze the graph. Just asking yourself questions to try to better understand what the question's asking and the information that is presented. And then lastly, depending on the question type, it can help to predict an answer. And this is especially useful for those who tend to overanalyze, who can talk themselves into any single answer choice. But by predicting an answer ahead of time and having some confidence in your thought process, you can just pick the answer that most aligns with what you thought of ahead of time. And this doesn't work for every single question type, but it does in a lot of instances in bio, and sometimes in CP as well. And with that, we'll just do a practice question together. So I'll read it. It says in the figure, the three curves represent hemoglobin oxygen binding at three different pH values. pH is of 7.2, 7.4, and 7.6. What conclusion can be drawn from these data about the oxygen binding of hemoglobin at different pH values? And so I just like you all to think, well, the first question we want to ask is, what is the question really asking? How can we rephrase it? And when I look at that, I think, okay, what conclusion can be drawn about these two things, oxygen binding and different pH values? So if I were to rephrase this question stem, I would say, how does pH affect oxygen binding of hemoglobin? And with that in mind, we can look at the graph and try to deduce, what do we think? What answers can we predict? What is the relationship we do see between oxygen binding and different pH values? So first, when we're looking at the graph, we want to look at the axes. So the first axis is the x-axis, which is the partial pressure of oxygen. The second axis is going to be the percent saturation of blood with O2. And if we want to know about how the oxygen binding of hemoglobin, we know that if it is in a higher affinity state, that means that at lower partial pressures of oxygen, meaning there's less oxygen there, it'll have a greater saturation of blood with O2. In other words, if a curve is shifted to the left, it's going to be a higher affinity. And just to recap how I knew that, or how I intuited that, I just thought, well, would something with a higher affinity for oxygen be able to bind at a lower partial pressure or a higher? Which one would a higher affinity hemoglobin be able to operate at? And I would say it would be able to bind at a lower partial pressure of oxygen. So that's why I would say a higher affinity would be off to the left, which would mean that the lower affinity would be off to the right. So if we were comparing these three curves, we would say the curve on the right is going to have the lowest affinity for oxygen. And if we look at the scale, or the legend, 7.2 is on the right, so it has the lowest affinity. And on the left, it's going to be the highest pH. So it looks like higher affinity follows higher pHs, and the lower affinities will be lower pHs. And with that prediction in mind, let's go through the answer choices and say maybe or maybe not for each answer. So the first one, A, is low pH favors the high affinity oxygen binding state. And this kind of seems like it's the opposite of what we just said, right? Because 7.2 is actually the lowest affinity. It's off to the right. So I'm just going to say maybe not for A. Well, let's read B. Low pH favors the low affinity oxygen binding state. That's exactly what we thought as we broke it down. That the lowest pH is actually going to be the lowest affinity. So 7.2 has the lowest affinity, meaning it had the lowest percent of saturation of blood with O2. So we really like B, but let's keep on going. C, oxygen affinity is independent of pH. Well, I just asked myself, what would it mean for it to be independent of pH? And I think if it were independent of pH, I wouldn't see any sort of relationship. There wouldn't be a relationship between pH and oxygen affinity. So all these curves would be the same if C were true. So I'm going to say maybe not for C. And then lastly, oxygen binding is not cooperative at a low pH. And I'm just going to ask myself, well, what do I know about cooperative binding? Do I know what that would look like on a graph? And many of you will learn this, if you don't know it already, that sigmoidal graphs represent cooperativity. So if it's sigmoidal, it is going to be cooperative. If it's not sigmoidal, which is this kind of S shape that I drew out, then it's not going to be cooperative. And since even 7.2, which is the lowest pH, is sigmoidal, I'm going to say maybe not for that one, because it's sigmoidal, therefore it's cooperative, not non-cooperative. And that's how I go back to B after comparing it to A, C, and D. And that's just a brief run through of how I'd approach a bio question.
Thank you, Landon. Now we have our last section, which is going to be presented by Derek. He's one of our newer tutors, but has already worked with a number of students and is currently getting ready to go to med school at NYU.
All right. Thanks, Asal. It's great to be here with you all today. And yeah, like she said, I'll be going over the psych-soc section. It's kind of a tongue twister there. But yeah, there are three main high-yield topics from the psych-soc section, and that's short-term and long-term memory. We see at the top there, personality disorders and theories of personality. So that would include things like schizoid personality disorder, the psychoanalytic theory of personality, or the trait theory of personality. All those would fall into personality. So it's a very far-reaching section. And then also a plethora of different biases that the MCAT has deemed that will affect your ability to become a great doctor. And some examples of those would be like selection bias and hindsight bias. And so some great strategies for the psych section, along with what Landon and Claire have said, and specifically like about the Socratic method, asking yourself questions to guide your thought process. These tips for cars and the other sections will help you as well in psych. And I think that's a great point to notice. You're not really just studying one section for the purpose of studying that section. It's going to help you answer questions in all the different sections. So we're sort of putting it all together here. But specifically regarding the PS section, it tends to be less time sensitive and more vocab heavy. I would say it's the most vocab heavy section. So it's super important to know that vocab like the back of your hand. Like with Landon said, know your amino acids like the back of your hand for the biology section. That same thing is vocab for the psych-soc section, not only for these high yield topics, but also for the rest of the topics as well. And then use your knowledge of memory. So creating things in the long-term memory as opposed to short-term memory. So we involve repetition to sort of put those terms in our long-term memory instead of short-term. And we make real-world connections with those terms and use mnemonic devices to help us remember all of these terms like the back of our hand. And I have a practice question on the next slide. And so this is a pretty typical example from the psych-soc section. And one of these MCAT questions is where we see sort of two questions in one. I'll show you how it goes here. But first of all, an increase in the activity of an infant's sympathetic nervous system is likely to, and that's where we see the first breakdown. We're seeing whether the sympathetic nervous system affects the absolute threshold, like in answers A and B, or whether it affects the just noticeable difference, like in answers C and D. So that's sort of the first thing we have to answer. And I want to ask myself, what do I know about these terms? And do I know any other terms that are associated with either the absolute threshold or the just noticeable difference? And so for me, when I first think about the just noticeable difference, the first term that comes to mind is Weber's law. And Weber's law states that an increase in the just noticeable difference is related to a proportional increase in the stimulus, or the other way around. So when the stimulus increases, the just noticeable difference increases as well. So we know that it's the size of the stimulus and not the activation of the sympathetic nervous system that's going to be affecting whether the just noticeable difference is increasing. And because of that, I can go ahead and eliminate C and D, because I know that the sympathetic nervous system isn't going to affect the just noticeable difference. And then that takes us to the second question. And that second question is whether the sympathetic nervous system will increase or decrease the absolute threshold at which I'll begin to attend to a stimulus. So essentially, what does that mean? What does it mean attending to a stimulus? And for me, that just means like being able to perceive that stimulus. And the sympathetic nervous system, as many of you may know, is in comparison with the parasympathetic nervous system. So first of all, what do I know about these two? Well, with the parasympathetic nervous system, I correlate that term with homeostasis. And with the sympathetic nervous system, I think about the fight or flight response. And so in this question, we're thinking about the sympathetic nervous system. And that question stemmed there. And so fight or flight, what does that mean to me? And how is it going to be related to this absolute threshold? So when I'm thinking about fight or flight, I like to picture that I'm in a scary movie. I'm in the middle of a forest and something's chasing after me. You know, I got my heart beating super fast. I'm not really worried about digestion. It's not really happening. I probably have dry mouth, something like that. And regarding the absolute threshold, if I hear something a mile away, like a twig snap, I'm probably going to perceive that because I want to be super attentive and trying to hear these things to give me any sort of clue as to what's chasing me, because my sympathetic nervous system is activated. I have that fight or flight and I'm super attentive. So I know that with the smallest stimulus, I'm still going to be able to perceive it. And so that would tell me that a decrease in the absolute threshold, I would still be able to perceive that stimulus. And that's answer B instead of answer A, which would be an increase in the absolute threshold. And so I usually use that example when I'm thinking about the sympathetic nervous system, because it can kind of tell me everything that's going on. And there will be a ton of questions, whether it's heart rate, whether it's blood pressure, that are affecting the sympathetic nervous system. And then parasympathetic nervous system, I use a different example. Like if I'm laying on the couch, pure homeostasis, not super attentive, low heart rate, that's when I'm digesting food, probably the potato chips I'm eating. But that's just a couple ways that I like to address these questions here. And yeah, a lot of these tips will help you with all the sections on the MCAT.
Yes, thank you, everyone. That was super useful. We're going into kind of the last half of the session here. We're going to have Tristan share his experience as a one-source medicine student and subsequently a tutor. Then we're going to have Joe explain the promo to you all that was mentioned in the email with the link when you got it to come here. And then we're going to have Joe go through a little mini consultation with everyone and kind of explain further what the program does. So I'm going to hand it off to Tristan.
Thank you, Asal. So everybody else kind of talked about like what sections are we going over in the MCAT, like how should you approach questions, but we haven't really touched on at all like how should you approach studying for the MCAT. I mean, that's a huge portion of what you're doing here. Is you're spending months leading up to this gigantic test, figuring out what you should and shouldn't know. So every good MCAT studying starts with a content review if you haven't done one with your classes or you don't have that great knowledge base that you need. It shows you the scope of what the MCAT is, what do you need to know, what don't you need to know. From there, you kind of go into your practice section of typically at OneSource, we use UWorld for the next portion of your studying. And what that is it's just a giant question bank with 3,000 questions in it of just MCAT question after MCAT question, because the scope of this test is gigantic. We touched on a couple of like these major topics, but if you see like the books that go over the content, like it's like that thick of books of knowledge that you need to know. And most of the time that's not even like every little detail that you need to know. That's just like the general idea. And UWorld kind of helps you go from, okay, I've got this general idea of everything that I need to know to, okay, like what are the specifics? What are the specific things that I need to know? Like, okay, do I need to know like what mass spectroscopy is? But then, okay, how do I read that graph? How do I interpret the graph to be able to answer questions about it? And then the last portion of your studying typically lasts a couple weeks to about a month. And that's going through all of your AAMC specific material of these are the questions that came from it. They're the most representative of the test. And then throughout this entire process, you're generally taking every couple weeks and then leading up usually every week, you're taking a full length practice exam. You're sitting down for 7.5 hours and you're taking this test. And that lets you see your progress. It helps you build that endurance for you being able to sit down for 7.5 hours, because that's a feat in of itself, is being able to sit down for 7.5 hours and not wander off and be able to focus on something and not feel completely dead at the end of it. And what we do as tutors is we make that whole process easier. As we go through, we are giving you the resources immediately off the bat to answer your question. You're not scouring the internet looking for the explanation to this one random question. It's right there at your fingertips by sending us a picture or sending us the question itself, and then us being able to walk you through step by step, personalized to you, how you're going to go through that, and maybe the gaps in your knowledge that are keeping you from being able to fully answer that question. And to me, that was what I found most helpful, because I spent probably about 2 months studying before I joined the program, and then 3 months after that studying for the test. And my studying after was so much more effective because I had that at my fingertips. Landon was actually my tutor. You can ask him. He probably got texts at like 1 a.m, like, hey, like, what is this random UWorld question? Like, please help me. And like, that's what helps, is just having that at your fingertips to be able to use the resource of somebody that knows what's going on and has been in your shoes before.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tristan. kind of going on to the last half of this session, I want to hand it off back to Joe to go over our promo that we have going on for you guys today.
Thanks, Asal. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen whenever I go through this here in just a second. But the promo that we have going on right now is going to include $200 off any of our comprehensive packages. And you will receive a follow-up email immediately after this with all of the information and the discount codes, etc. So it's $200 off any of the comprehensive tutoring packages, which I'll talk about in a second, as well as 10% off any of our pay-as-you-go plans. And I can distinguish between the two here in a little bit if you would like, or if anybody wants to talk about that during the Q&A, we can do that as well. All of this information is also on the website. And again, the discount codes will arrive via email along with the recording of this meeting, which I forgot to do at the very beginning, but I've been recording using a third-party software, so don't worry about it. I just didn't want everybody to freak out that I was randomly starting the recording in the middle, but we will have it. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just walk you all through what this process will look like if you do decide to work with us within our program. And please feel free to ask questions at any point near the end of this or whenever it makes sense. So we start out here with our Google Drive with our students folder. These are all people who are actively working with us right now, but I do have one student who I've asked if I can use her folder as the primary example here in the consultation meetings. And if you do want to sign up for a consultation meeting with us at any point, I will walk through this more specifically as it pertains to you after I ask you maybe 15, 20 minutes of questions about you and where you are with the MCAT process, because we do place a huge emphasis on personalization. And so this can be a little bit more relevant to you if it's just a one-on-one discussion with me. And again, the link to do that is on the website. So within the students folder, we start out with a whole bunch of resources that anybody has access to. This includes a bunch of whiteboard videos that I've made over the course of time. Some of these can be found on our social media profiles. There are a few open source textbooks in here, a bunch of study guides that we've made over the course of time, equation sheets, just a variety of different resources. However, none of these are really part of the program so much as they are just there in case you need to reference them throughout the process. Where everything really starts with us is that in the first meeting with your tutor, you build out this file that we call the MCAT syllabus. This file looks like this. It's kind of overwhelming at first, but this is built out partially in your very first meeting, but then more thoroughly throughout the process. The first thing we do is scroll down here to the end and put in your ideal test date. And then we'll work backward from there, scheduling out when you should take each of the AAMC exams, as well as when you should finish UWorld, when you should take any third-party exams if you're somebody who happens to be retaking the test. In particular, that's relevant, when you should finish different aspects of content review. And then we'll come all the way up here to present day and think about what resources you have available to you. So you can see that we are referencing Physics 1, 2, 4, 9, Gen Chem 1, 2, 3, and 4. I think for this student, those happen to be the Kaplan books that we were using. However, we've had people use the Princeton Review books, people use Exam Crackers, any number of resources. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing is actually as relevant to you as it possibly can be. So that's why we go with a variety of resources on that front. And then we'll schedule them throughout the process. Usually on average, people will go through about 8 weeks of content review initially. However, if you come to us like Tristan did, or like somebody who may be retaking the test, having already gotten through content pretty thoroughly and doing well, then this will look totally different for you. I've had some students do 30 chapters a week in the Kaplan books during content review, and so we knock it out in 2 weeks. And I've had people do 4 chapters a week because they may be busy with school or whatever else they have going on. And you can also see that we jump around a whole bunch during the content review phase. For instance, in this week, you can see that we covered Physics 5 and 6, which are electrostatics and circuits, along with Gen Chem 11 and 12, which are electrochemistry and redox reactions, and Biology 4 and 11, which are nervous system and musculoskeletal system. The reason we do this is not just to make you have to read random chapters constantly. It's because you can sort of see how those different ideas, even though they're across disparate disciplines, juxtaposed to really give you an idea of how ions move across a membrane, just for instance. Because the MCAT really cares a lot more about your understanding of the big picture that underlies physical reality than it does your ability to memorize long lists of things. That's what medical school's for, trust me. All of these are study guides that I made in medical school. Anyway, so as you move throughout the process, we will also give you a UWorld account when it comes time for you to start UWorld. We have a deal with them that lets us purchase in bulk for a discount. And we also get a faculty portal that lets us track your progress through UWorld. I'll pull that up in a little bit if anybody wants to see it, but it lets us see what you're doing well on and what you're doing poorly on so that we can plan accordingly come up with a really good time for you to take that first practice test, as well as add supplementary resources throughout the process as needed. We'll update the schedule constantly throughout your process. So you'll usually only build out the first week or two with a high degree of specificity up front. And then we'll continuously update as we move through to make sure that whatever you're doing on a given day is actually relevant for you. The next component of this that I want to show you is what we do during the meeting. So you've already seen a little bit of that. However, I wanted to take particular note to show you that we do have a little bit different way of drawing on the screen normally during meetings than you saw there. We don't always use the zoom annotate function. Everybody who works for us has an artist pen display. These are just flat monitors that lay down on the desk that we can draw on with a stylus, like this. I think that's the right stylus. And this allows us to type into the screen as well as to draw out pictures to illustrate concepts a little bit more effectively so that we can talk about whatever you want to talk about. And that's really the way that we start all of our meetings too. We always start out by asking you what questions you have on any topics that you've been covering lately. And this isn't really so that we can abdicate the responsibility of building a lesson plan or anything like that. It's more so that we can make sure that whatever we're going to go through is actually relevant for you, rather than having some pre-planned order of moving through things that doesn't really matter to you, that you may already know or you may be too far behind to get much use out of at all. So you can see this is a picture of a nephron that I drew out in a meeting with a student. Here's another one that's a picture of an action potential graph. However, if we get started and I ask you a couple of questions about action potentials and you tell me that the sodium upshoots due to voltage gated sodium channels opening, and then they get deactivated at the top of the peak at the same time that the slow voltage gated potassium channels open and then fall down to the refractory period, etc., then I'm not going to take the time to draw up this entire thing. We're going to just be talking about whatever's relevant for you at any given time. We also spend time going through passages, just like Landon and Claire kind of indicated during their sections, showing you how to take notes effectively as you move through passages, as well as how to go through questions effectively. You can really bring in anything to us at any point. These are a few examples of UWorld passages I did with somebody. And if something from the passage isn't really making a lot of sense to you, then we can always jump back over to the whiteboard and draw out any sort of, OChem reactions. I actually drew this earlier today when I was talking with a student, as well as go through anything else that you would like to talk about. And that's really what has turned out to be the benefit of the 525 and higher scorers. It's not so much that anybody cares, like I said earlier, whether we've done exceptionally well or just really pretty well. What really matters is that we're able to personalize everything to you and to teach off script at any point. So then the last component of this, and then I'll move on and let somebody else talk, is over here back in the students folder. At the end of each meeting, we will always upload the notes from that meeting into this notes from our discussions folder. The main reason we do this is just so that you don't have to worry about taking notes throughout the meeting. You can just be totally present for the discussion and access our notes later on. So you can scroll through this and see whatever the tutor had drawn out during this meeting. Clearly, this wasn't me. This is somebody who has a lot better handwriting than I do. But some people use this. A lot of people don't really use it at all, though. And the main reason that most people have started not using it at all is that we also include all of the video files from all of our meetings. So you can see this is the student's video files from every meeting she's ever had with us. That way, if she is, if we explain, let's say, titrations for the very first time to her in a meeting, and then she understands it, and that's fantastic. But then 2 weeks later, she gets crushed, misses 4 out of 5 questions on a passage about titrations. Then she doesn't have to come back and necessarily ask us. She can if she wants, but what ends up being a lot easier for people and more cost effective as well is just to pull up the 10 minutes from the meeting where we had made titrations make sense for the first time and just review that briefly. We've also recently started including unlisted YouTube playlists for each student so that they can just go back and watch any of their meetings at any given time. So you can pull this up on your phone while you're working out. While you're driving, you can listen to it. Don't watch it while you're driving. That's my disclaimer. But you can really just access anything anytime you want. We usually recommend people just watch the parts that are relevant. You don't have to sit and watch your entire hour and a half or 2 hour meeting again. But this is just another useful resource that I found to be pretty popular lately. And then the final component of this that I need to show is the hour tracking sheet. So if you've been on our website at all, you will have noticed that we price everything based on time spent working with the tutors because all of these people are excellent and we want to make sure that we can pay them well. And so that's our primary overhead. So in this hour tracking sheet, at the end of each meeting, the tutor will come into this sheet, and let me zoom in on this. The tutor comes into the sheet and enters the total amount of time that you spent in the meeting in this column, as well as the date of the meeting here. And this total amount of time is pretty variable, just depending on whatever you had to cover that day. You know, if you finish a meeting that was supposed to last 2 hours and 60 minutes, then we're not going to make you stick around and just to charge you extra money. We're just going to call that quits and let you move on with your life. And then in this column, they always enter the number of those minutes that we view as being billable from that meeting. And so to us, what that means is time spent actually efficiently prepping for the MCAT, not time spent talking about whatever you did last weekend or the NBA finals or Donald Trump getting arrested or anything like that. It's just time spent specifically focused on the MCAT. That way you can know that you're going to get at least what you pay for whenever you sign up to work with us, if not more, hopefully the latter. And then this column is basically just column D divided by column C so that you can know what percent you were billed for any given meeting. You can see that this is a little bit variable too. This person, I think, liked to be off topic a little bit more because she had 78% overall billed. This is normally going to be 85, 90%, just FYI. And then this column here just shows you the total number of hours that you purchased. And you can see that it counts down over the course of time from the billable hours column so that you can always know how much time you have left, whether you need to buy more hours, and I can talk about that in a second, or whether you're going to have some left over that you can then roll over to admissions advising credit, just for the sake of your information. And then finally, in this column, we will always type a brief snippet on what we did during the given meeting. That way that if you do want to go back and rewatch the meeting, like for instance, if you wanted to go back and watch the endocrine menstrual cycle discussion that we had here, I've got it pulled up. You can just click on the meeting link right there. Our logo flies in, and then you can just move through. And I pulled one in that I had done just to show an example, but you can move through and watch whatever part of the meeting was actually relevant for you personally. So that it pretty much concludes my rundown of this program. I'm happy to, again, have a consultation meeting with any of you if you do choose to sign up on the website. The links are all over the place, preferably the MCAT ones. If you sign up for LSAT, you'll be talking to somebody else. But I think that's pretty much it. That's all. You can take it back from here.
Yeah, so that pretty much concludes the session for today. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put in the chat and mute. Anything like that, you could ask any one of us, Joe, or the tutors. If not, you're all free to go, and you'll definitely get an email with follow-up information and the promo codes. Thank you so much for coming.